Let's go to the Bill of Rights now. The primary purpose was to act as an additional layer of protection against possible federal government tyranny. That's the purpose of the Bill of Rights. Our founders would not have approved our Constitution without this additional layer of protection. Let me touch on a few amendments as time permits. Let's look at the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people to peacefully assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances. Notice that this is a prohibition against the federal government, not against states, counties, or school districts, isn't it? It says Congress shall make no law. How is that a prohibition against Georgia or the school district here or anything else? It says Congress shall make law respecting established religion, which was creating a national denomination, which was what we're escaping from England, because there the Church of England was dominant. If you were to preach outside of that church authority, you could be hung. We didn't want that in this country. We wanted freedom of religion. So we didn't want a national denomination to be created. And we wanted to have the free exercise thereof. So this is just strictly a prohibition against the federal government. And the reason I say that is simple. If you go back in history, you'll find that many of the states had their own preferred denominations for that state. It was a states' rights issue, a states' power issue. Religious test. It's not allowed under the Constitution because the states had their own religious test. Did you know that in Georgia you had to swear an oath that you were a Protestant or you couldn't hold public office? If you lived in one of the northern states, and many of the states, they had tests that said essentially you had to believe in the Old Testament, the New Testament, Jesus Christ and the life hereafter, or you could not hold public office. Now, why would that be? Because they believe that if you didn't believe in a future state of punishment and reward, in other words, a judgment day, when you got behind closed doors, you would say and do one thing. When you got out in the front to the people, you would say and do something totally different. But if you believe that God is watching every moment and there's a judgment day for sins, then you're going to be careful what you do in private. And that's why they had these religious tests. And the reason they don't have a religious test authorized under our Constitution is because they didn't want a religious test to be dominant over their own. That explains a lot. It's not taught that way in our schools. It's taught that we have a irreligious, secular constitution. In fact, a little aside, there's a book that's actually being used in our universities today. It's entitled The Godless Constitution. And they go through all the reasons why it's not a spiritual doctrine, has nothing to do with God or religion. But the interesting point is when you get to the very back, they said that they dispense with the usual scholarly work of footnotes. Just trust us. So much for that book. How do we get from here to the prohibition of prayer in schools and public meetings and the use of the Bible in our schools? In 1946, the Supreme Court found an obscure letter from President Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptist ministers. Now, what happened was the Danbury Baptist ministers wrote Thomas Jefferson a letter saying they were concerned about the possibility of a national denomination being created. He wrote them back and said, look, guys, paraphrasing, don't worry about that because the First Amendment creates a wall of separation between church and state, so you can't have a national denomination. Well, guess what? These words were taken out of context. Why did they use Thomas Jefferson for the authority here? Because he was the ambassador of France during when the Constitution was written. He wasn't involved in writing the Constitution. The reason they used him is because they could find no other source for this ruling. And they had to take it out of context to find that source. To show the utter violation of the intent of Jefferson's letter, let's look at some facts here. Jefferson went to church in the U.S. Capitol building for most of his presidency. He used the Marine Corps band for the music. He selected the Holy Bible and the Watts hymnal to be used in the D.C. schools. Now, why would we think somebody that would do all those things have church in the Capitol building, that there'd be a separation of church and state. That became the largest church in all of D.C. They also held church in the Treasury Department building and other buildings. They had no idea of the separation of church and state the way the courts have imposed it. Jefferson said while the president, "No nation has ever existed or been governed without religion, nor can be. The Christian religion is the best religion that has been given to man, and I, as chief magistrate of this nation, am bound to give it the sanction of my example." Does that sound like somebody that wants to have this separation of church and state where you have no religious principles anywhere in the government? I don't believe so. It should be clear that in 1947, when the Supreme Court ruled that there was an impenetrable wall of separation between church and state, that they were simply advancing their own agenda and not properly interpreting the Constitution. Another aside here, of all the judges that made this ruling, the ones that voted for it had never been a judge before, one of which was one of the founders of the ACLU. Does that sort of help explain things a little bit? And so that's what I mentioned about that. I think that's extremely important. This is all part of our battle of worldviews. We have given the other side control of our courts, folks.